Hi, I'm Brandon Harrison. I'm Associate Features Programmer for Doc NYC. I am very pleased to welcome director Philip Carter and producer Sheryl Crown to talk about their film, Neither Confirm Nor Deny. So Philip, Sheryl, welcome to Doc NYC.
Thank you for having us.
Glad to talk with you guys. I mean, it's funny considering the times we're in involving, government and things that are going on. Such a film that is a lot more timely than you would think, considering the historical breadth. I just want to go back to the beginning of how this came together, especially with the book and then your subjects. How did this story come to be, and how did you figure out how to craft this narrative?
Sure. I mean, it was 6 years back when we first started on this story. I first came across a snippet about this thing called a Zorian, this kind of crazy CIA plot to steal a sunken Soviet submarine. And, it really intrigued me, and I wanted to find out more. And I kind of kept digging around in this thing, and I kept thinking, can this really be true? And everything I read and found out about it seemed to just to sort of enhance the story. And eventually I managed to reach out and contact David Sharp, who's our principal character in the film, and he was extremely gracious and welcoming and open to the idea of us making a film about his story and about the book that he just published. And then I went to Sheryl and New Sparta Films, and we began the long process of pulling this thing into the film it is today.
And just to say about that, when Phil pitched the project, I thought, wow, this is an extraordinary spy story. I don't understand how it could have happened. And then I thought it was an extraordinary investigative journalism story as well. It was two stories in one. And we actually thought the scale of it was so huge that we could tell this as a documentary feature and also as a fiction feature. So we sort of developed simultaneously the doc feature and a fiction feature, but we're really pleased that the doc feature is now completed and is telling the big story of the sort of the journalist approach to this major issue and also the spy thriller. And we're just so grateful that the CIA guys and the journalists who contributed were so willing to talk about this.
I was curious about that early stages of contact and maybe reticence, or what was that process like? How did that go? Were there any difficulties?
There were. I mean, these guys, are intrinsically programmed, I guess, to not talk and to keep their work and so on private. David had obviously managed to get an approval from the CIA to have his book published, and therefore was at some liberty to discuss whatever was in the book. There were sort of obviously questions about going any further than that, but David managed to negotiate and get an agreement to participate and so on in the film. The other two principal characters, Curtis Crook and Walter Lloyd, both of those guys had never spoken about this publicly. So, with David's assistance, we kind of approached these guys and, managed to explain what we were trying to do, and that we were trying to be authentic and really set their story in film. And they were, open-minded and gracious and kind enough to allow us to spend time with them and to eventually film with them.
And we spent a lot of time with them. We went to a trip. We went over to the States with research and filming. And once we spent 4 or 5 days with David and 4 days with Walt. I mean, we had a long time to go over the story. And that really opened up some things. And fantastic that Walt, the whole expression that we actually now used, we can neither confirm nor deny. We met the guy who invented that, it's extraordinary. So we all just use it. So we were very blessed that they were confident and trusting, and that we could develop this film properly, spend the time and hear their side of the story. Phil was always upfront about he always wanted to get the journalist side of it too, and that was another story that we can talk to you about separately, which was another challenge, but we got there in the end too.
I mean, that's what was my next question, especially in terms of filmmaking. You have this one story that is an amazing hook. Oh my God, the Soviet sub and CIA and all these things, but also this concurrent story with the journalistic aspect of finding it out and what's that mean and the interplay. How did that process come together in terms of breaking down that narrative for viewers so we can understand what was going on and entertainment value? How do you guys pull that off?
I mean, I think the the story does work on a number of levels, and obviously it is kind of a jaw-dropping spy heist in its own right, but it's also touches upon issues that are as kind of relevant today as they were back in 74, 75. And this real question of national security and the kind of internal tensions between an administration, a government, and the press. And this aspect of the film, while we were making it, was becoming bubbling up to the surface again and again over the last number of years of the Trump administration. And it was really important to us that this element of the CIA plan, which was this cover story involving Howard Hughes and the creation of this whole new industry of ocean mining, that was a total fiction, but it was a fiction which was sold very successfully by the CIA. And there were, the press were partly consumers of that, and then eventually, the undoing of that cover story through, some pretty tenacious work by journalists such as Cy Hirsch, who obviously is featured in the film, and another, extraordinary journalist called Jack Anderson, who I hadn't known much about before I started work on this film, but is this staggering journalistic figure in the 1970s in the US. And they were so integral really to the success or failure of this mission that we really felt we had to get their story into the film.
But interestingly, we spent the time with the CIA key guys first, so we understood that side of the story. Clearly, Howard Hughes is a gift to any filmmaker because he's notoriously, we obviously couldn't talk to any of his people ever, but we were able to have that, that wonderful spy thriller feeling to it. But I think on the journalistic side, we approached them a lot later, didn't we, Phil, when we actually knew what we needed to be covering on the journalistic side.
Yeah.
And we, most of them are in Washington. Seymour Hersh took us a long time to get, but we're really happy we got him in the end, because obviously he was the guy who uncovered the story very, very early on, but agreed at that point with the CIA to do a deal to not break it. And I suppose the question we ask ourselves now, can you ever imagine now the CIA and the press agreeing to hold back a story for the national interest? I mean, times have really changed. And it's not as if Nixon, was everybody's favorite boy at that time, but somehow the relationship between the press and the administration was sufficiently founded on, well, you scratch my back, I scratch mine, we'll do this together. And it sort of worked. And then Jack Anderson, who's Maverick and, sadly isn't alive for us to have filmed him, was a guy who Cy Hirsch knew as well. But we certainly approached the CIA first, and then we came a few years later to be able to come and get the story of the press, always knowing that's what we were going to do.
With such an archival heavy film of transcripts and footage and older interviews, and what was the process like in terms of putting together this film in an editing room, but also, when you're trying to envision it beforehand, when you're storyboarding, what was that like? And also, were there any just surprises when going through all of that old stuff?
Yeah, I mean, it was there was a kind of treasure trove of material in some ways, and in fact, as we kind of kept looking, more stuff would emerge. Some of it was, just truly remarkable. I mean, for me, one of the highlights was all this Nixon library footage, a Super 8 footage that the Nixon's aides shot while they're going about. It gives this kind of incredible, intimate, unguarded view into the Nixon administration. And that was a real highlight. But yeah, there was a challenge in trying to marshal all the material into something coherent. But that is, with a kind of historical story like this, we were just grateful that we had some pretty extraordinary material, including material from the mission itself, which I don't believe has ever been seen before, and is very evocative and powerful material. And so we had we had the problem, I guess, of thinning material down in the end, certainly in some places. But it was, yeah, a pretty intense process.
We also made a decision with that anybody who was in the film was actually authentically involved with the film. We didn't want any expert commentary. We didn't want any third party talking about this administration or that administration. It had to be first-hand experience. So journalists like Hank Filippi, you know, who was there with the Freedom of Information Act, she was there, she was a vital part of this story. So we only worked with people who could tell us the story from their perspective. And interestingly, we were lucky with some of the resources, some of the mission footage, which, you know, we were able to use, which has never been seen. And honestly, it was a nightmare in relation to archive. Film producers and directors will always tell you that it's a nightmare using archive, but we were really lucky to get some of the original, you know, sort of handheld stuff from the White House, as well as people's home movies, as well as some of the, you know, more conventional news footage.
How have your principals, have they seen the film in its completed form, or is there have to be approved potentially? What do they think, or what do they think about this final product?
Sorry. Do you want to go, Sheryl?
Yeah, I think it was really important to us after work. You know, you work with real people for 5 years. You get very close to them, and they're your friends. And it was very, very important to us that they really were on side with the film. But they didn't have approvals. You know, they didn't have contractual approvals. But we are respectful of their thoughts. I hope we've been respectful. So certainly the key CIA guys have all seen the film and approved it. In fact, been quite positive and glad the story is out there. Clearly it's nobody's seen it very much. And we've yet to show it to our principal journalists because we want to announce it to them when we announce it to the festival. But, you know, I feel with respect, we've tried to be truthful to both parties in the story. And I think to that extent, everybody's on side as yet. Phil?
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I mean, you know, I think it's always a challenge when someone's spent such a story has been such a big part of someone's life for such a long time, and they have such, you know, strongly imprinted memories and perspectives of a story. When a kind of third party gets involved and takes their view of the story, I guess it's always going to be, you know, something of a not a shock, but it's going to be a different imagining than the one they may have carried for so many years. But I think that, you know, we've had a very, you know, positive and reflective response from the principals.
Ultimately, what would you guys like people to take away from this project?
Well, I think it's you know, on one thing, it's just a staggering ambition that was allowed to kind of, you know, was given its head at the time, and an amazing, remarkable enterprise really to try to achieve what they set out to achieve. And again, I think the other thing is something I mentioned earlier, which is that some of these issues are still here as live and current today as they were back in the mid-70s. This conflict, or this challenge between the press and administrations over the public's right to know what their governments are doing, that's not something that's going to go away. And I think this film is a kind of fantastic vehicle or prism in which to explore some of those issues.
And I think I'd like them to take away the fact that this wasn't incredible, you know, this was a real live spy story. This was the Russians lost a nuclear submarine. The Americans found it, and they wanted to raise it from 3 miles from the bottom of the ocean to see what was in it. And it took 6 and 7 years, and it was capitalized. But actually what emerges for me is the human drama of that, the human costs for the guys who are involved, the stresses of that, understanding. I think the film gives you a real insight into the intricacies of how the CIA work and how the secrecy, I was really impressed with the sort of the secrecy that was maintained for quite a long time. So it's the human drama, it's the sheer sort of heist nature of it. But as really, I think the bigger issue for me always in film is what questions still remain resonant today with administrations. Is there trust between governments and their people? Is there trust between governments and their press? And increasingly in all our societies, we're understanding that this is becoming very, very fractured.
Very, very well said, Sheryl. Thank you, Sheryl. Thank you, Philip, for joining us at Doc NYC. Thanks so much.
Thank you.